probably a better seats up there. Welcome to the School of Architecture. Briefly, tonight is a time to come together to honor, in memory, a friend, a colleague, an architect, and most important, a great teacher. We at USC are very proud to have had Konrad Wachsman amongst us over those many years. This then is a special occasion for each of us as we meet together and join in this event to remember and to recall. I'll turn the evening's program over to three who number among his many distinguished friends: Esther McCoy, Tommy Taylor, and Robertson Ward. May I introduce Esther McCoy, a longtime friend of Konrad's, an historian, critic, writer, and a dear friend of mine.
Konrad Wachsman presented his tribute to Charles Eames in November 1978. I remember the invitation. Several images, surreal images of the underside of Eames' plastic chairs. To Konrad, Eames's message was the wire supports, exact and orderly. Konrad's presentation at the tribute was not exact and orderly. He fluttered around distractedly, as if he were getting things in order for the main speaker. He spoke conversationally to someone in the audience, as if inquiring whether the projector was ready. It was not in Konrad's nature to act like the main attraction. There was not an ounce of self-importance in him. As he made a point about Eames, he would stop and agree with himself, yeah. As if this was something he was to remember to say when his turn came. The tribute was a team effort. At one point, a violinist sitting on the aisle removed her instrument from its case and walked forward and played. Someone spoke about Eames in his first factory. It was also unstaged. Konrad's seminars were like that. I attended two in 1974. He was tentative, winding up for the main event. Yeah. To his students, it was the main event. I talked to some of them alone later. They agreed that their strongest compulsion was not to let down the team. Their tribute to Konrad was team support. The seminars were taped. I wonder if someone listening to these tapes in the next century will understand how a man as gentle as Konrad held such sway over students. Konrad told many stories about himself. They may not all be true. He tended to exaggerate. He said, for instance, that Mies van der Rohe was afraid in a car. So Konrad drove from the West Coast to Chicago at 110 miles. But at any rate, this is Konrad's picture of Mies as a careful man, and of himself. He was born in 1901 in the provincial town of Frankfurt Oder. The event took place in the former throne room of the town palace of an archbishop's diocese. The throne had long been replaced with a bed where his parents slept. But a dark painting remained on the wall, stretching 20 feet from floor to the Italian Renaissance plaster ceiling. It depicted the coronation of King Solomon. That was what Konrad was born under. As a boy, Konrad wandered among the magnificent Gothic vaults of the first floor and the basement, silent and moody. His father, a pharmacist, did not know what to make of this sensitive child. He was not a good student. What would happen to him? His father died when he was 10, and Konrad at 14 was apprenticed to a carpenter and cabinet maker. It was then he started to learn, to read. He loved working with wood. He always liked to minimize his formal education, but he did have formal training. During the First World War, he studied at the Academy of Art in Dresden. He studied under the great Heinrich Tessenow, whose work Konrad considered a pure and most human statement. The end of the war was a time of crippling inflation, the early 20s. Konrad was forced back to Berlin. Hans Polzig, who taught at the Academy of Applied Art, gave him a place to live with his family and work to do while he studied at the Academy. The surrealistic environment in which Polzig lived was the Imperial Palace in the park of Sanssouci near Potsdam. To Konrad, it was less satisfying than the life he'd begun to lead at the Café Romaneschi. There he sat at tables with the new young intellectuals, with Bertolt Brecht, the dramatist, Erwin Piscator of the theater. There were filmmakers, poets, chess masters, scientists, airplane pilots. Sometimes Konrad picked up a day's work building film sets. One was for the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The cafe was his real education, he said. In the cafe, the values were real. In this climate, the young intellectuals built new, better worlds. At the cafe tables, they fought battles for new ideals. Inflation became so fantastic that the price of a meal doubled while one ate it. The situation was desperate. Konrad set out for Holland to seek work with Aud, the rationalist architect. Nothing. He moved from his hotel to a Salvation Army shelter. Then there was no money at all. He was jailed and deported. He went to Paris to ask Le Corbusier for work. He was given unpaid work doing renderings of a building for Moscow. Many years later, when Konrad was invited to Moscow to lecture, he recognized the building. In Paris, he sold papers on the street to live. Finally, when he weighed 110 pounds, he wrote his sister for money. She sent him a ticket to Berlin. Hans Polzig, his professor, visited him. He was shocked by his condition. He arranged for Konrad to go to Niski in Silesia, a village settled by a Protestant sect from Bohemia in the 18th century. There he could regain his health and work. The one industry in the town was prefabricated building units. The factories had been in production since the 19th century. This was Konrad's turning point. For the first time, he saw mass production. The prefabricated panel systems for housing hospitals, schools, were sent out all over the world. He planned to stay 3 weeks. He stayed 3 years. Whenever anyone spoke of the monotony produced by prefabrication, he remembered the calmness of the town of Niski. 18th century neoclassical buildings, all the same height, the same window dimensions, everything standardized. In this self-imposed universal system, there was harmony, contentment. Konrad sensed for the first time the equilibrium between man and nature. It was his first lesson in how a group, a team, a whole community worked together. In time, he was made chief architect. One of the first changes he made in the catalog was to offer clients the opportunity to buy prefabricated elements rather than whole buildings. These they could combine into whatever building type was needed. At age 28, he returned to Berlin and opened his own practice. His main work was in houses of wood. One of these was a house on the lake for Albert Einstein. Einstein was passionately fond of boats, and there were various images in the house that were drawn from boats. Konrad worked out a system of his own for houses, using standardized dimensions and joints. In 1929, he wrote a book on wood construction, Holst's Hausbau, published by Wachsman. The introduction began, "Today, machines and factory produce houses, but not as a craftsman's enterprise." When his commissions began to dwindle, he questioned his goals. He wanted time to think. This he managed to get. In 1932, he received a prix de Rome. He left Germany for almost the last time. In Rome, he found himself living for the 3rd time in a palace, this time among scholars. He had no choice but to accept the gift. But he wished instead he were in New York or Chicago. There he could experience an environment created by the machine. He would rather have seen skyscrapers, grain elevators, bridges, highways. Instead, he was studying history. Restless, he began to travel. But he found he was walking through the pages of a book he already knew, The Rise and Decline of Civilizations, of Art and Beauty. Would he always be confronted with the heroic past, he wondered? When could he do his own work? He wanted to create a market for building elements from which any kind of building could be assembled, in any variation or combination, for any purpose. The great classicist, Schickel, had once been Konrad's idol. His new idol was Joseph Paxton. It was the Crystal Palace that had ushered in 20th century building. Paxton's proposal for the Crystal Palace consisted only of the description of the building elements, the method by which they were fabricated, and the manner of assembly, and above all, the schedule for construction. Therein, Konrad knew, resided the meaning of the industrialized world. These dreams became more urgent as Germany fell under the leadership of Hitler. Konrad's friends had fled. He knew it would be dangerous for him to return to Germany. Discouraged with his prospects, he borrowed a Leica and began photographing the buildings of the past, recognizing their beauty, but knowing that their message was to the past. A German publisher saw some of them, and suggested that Konrad do a series of guidebooks of Italy, with an advance Konrad bought a second-hand Fiat and risked driving to Germany to stock up on Agfa films and to see his mother. He was not stopped at the border because of his Italian license plates. He begged his mother and sister to return to Italy with him. They were sure he was exaggerating. The danger in Germany could not be that great. He left them behind. It was the last time he would ever see them. As he left Germany, the guards noted his Italian license plates and cried, "Aviva Mussolini." But when he returned to Rome as a photographer, he was thrown back into architecture. By luck, he managed to get a building to design, a 4-story apartment house of reinforced concrete. Then there were several others to do for the same client. I doubt if Konrad ever photographed them. He spoke of them always as concrete systems he had worked out. His career as an architect was interrupted again. Italy attacked Ethiopia. Germany invaded Austria and Czechoslovakia. When Konrad had a building under construction, Hitler came to Rome to pay Mussolini a visit. Konrad was ordered to leave the country for the duration of Hitler's stay. The only place he could get a passport for was Corfu. When he returned, he knew that time was running out. First he went to Paris, then Grenoble. He lived on the charity of friends. One day, looking at the lampposts in the streets, he thought, what marvelous structural shapes could be made from tubular steel. He began designing. He was developing, in essence, what later became his mobilar structure. Even to buy the paper to make his structural notes was a sacrifice. Finally, he wrote about his plight to Einstein in England. Einstein replied that he was then supporting many, many people in even greater danger. And he apologized for being able to offer Konrad only $10 a month. Konrad's last stop before being incarcerated in France was Bonse. There, an English poet offered him an abandoned stable to live in. He knew no English. The poet taught him 5 words. The only words he knew when he finally arrived in America. They were, a thunderstorm refreshes the atmosphere. Filmmakers and artists came up the mountainside to Bonse. People poorer than himself, all seeking refuge. Every evening, Konrad watched for the searchlights of the tower at Antibes. One night, the lights did not go on. Konrad wrote of this, I trembled. I knew now the war had started. I knew then that I would never see my mother again. He was right. All his family was murdered. The next morning, Konrad walked down to the town. He saw the soldiers ordering foreigners to equip themselves with a blanket and food for the day and to report to the police station. At the stadium at Antibes, 1,000 refugees collected. When asked to state their work, Konrad spoke in French. As soon as he said the word architect, he was sent at once to the commander. He was made the architect of the camp. His duty was to build barracks for 1,000 persons. Konrad started by introducing teamwork. He wrote, I organized groups of 12 to be ready the next day. I then estimated the amount of lumber that would be required. The next morning, my crew and I were on a truck to pick up the lumber, the hammer, nails, saws. We built jigs to saw the wood to standard dimensions for columns, trusses, siding, floor joists. The simple window and door frames were covered with chicken wire. Barracks for 1,000 people were finished in 10 days. 4 weeks later, we were all evacuated. We were sent to a brick factory near Aix-en-Provence. The huge kiln tunnels were our bedrooms. The factory spaces our living quarters. Among the refugees was Max Ernst, the surrealist painter. After 4 months, Peggy Guggenheim came and got him out and took him to America. There were publishers, writers, scientists, sculptors, theater people, stage designers. The talk was lively. For the first time in many months, we all had enough to eat, Konrad wrote. Konrad said once about Eames, there was a moral in all his films. I see a beautiful moral in all that Konrad built. The hot and cold water installation, for instance, that he built to serve the 1,200 internees. The stage he built in one of the large storage bins so they could put on plays. As France was invaded, they had reason to despair, but they put on plays. Finally, all internees who wanted to were permitted to join the French army. Konrad did. They heard then about the Dunkirk disaster. When Konrad's regiment crossed the Loire, the Germans were already in Marseille. They destroyed the Pont Transborder, which bridged the inner harbor entrance to Marseille. 10 years later, Konrad sat one day in a restaurant in New York with Le Corbusier. Konrad said, he asked me what I thought was the most beautiful structure in this century. I hope, Konrad said, you are not expecting me to say the Villa Savoie. No, Corb said. Konrad then proposed that each write the name of the structure and compare them. They had both written Pont Transborder. In his book, The Turning Point, Konrad called it a monument of extraordinary beauty. It was a kind of aerial ferry. The ferry platform carried by a system of suspension cables. Konrad was 40 years old in 1941, when, with the help of Albert Einstein and Walter Gropius, then both in America, he received a visa and set out for New York. When he saw the skyscrapers for the first time, he said, "This is my city. This is my scale." He wrote, "I came from a black, bleak, sad, motionless, bleeding world. Here was life as I'd never seen it before. I almost wanted to cry." He was at home in a country whose language he did not know, except for 5 words taught him by an English poet. A thunderstorm refreshes the atmosphere. But he understood the people. He understood industrialization, and the scale was his. Thank you.
It's given me great pleasure to see so many of Konrad's friends here tonight. Were he here, I think he would be well satisfied. He enjoyed having the friends around him and to have full room of people to have elegant discussion like Esther's, terrible one that God will give, and the beautiful one that Robertson will give with great pleasure to him. But I must go rather quickly because I want to review all of the projects that he did. So we'll not talk much about them, but we'll try to show them on the slides. In lieu of making a general statement, I would like to read to you, if I may, an introduction that John Intenza, the editor of and owner of the Art and Architecture magazine, the best architecture magazine I think ever produced in America. At the time, the director of the Graham Foundation, Konrad was giving a lecture at an exhibition at that institution in Chicago. He said at that time, as early as 1925, Konrad Wachsman had an architectural practice in Berlin, published a book on wood construction, and among other projects, undertook a house for Albert Einstein. He won the Prix de Rome, and in the interval preceding his coming to America in 1941, went through unbelievable ventures of triumph, destruction, incarceration, and escape. In Cambridge, he associated himself with Walter Gropius, and later, in a partnership with Gropius, developed the General Panel Corporation, designing one of the most brilliantly conceived projects in modular construction. In 1949, he was professor of design and director of the Department of Advanced Building Research of the Institute of Design at Illinois Institute of Technology. And there, in 1951, designed a building system for a series of airplane hangars for the United States Air Force. He has traveled under the aegis of the American State Department, lecturing and giving seminars in the Orient, Middle East, and Europe, which also sponsored major showings of his work in Vienna, Munich, Rome, and Amsterdam. There has been the usual flood of papers and publications, and particularly in 1961, a remarkable book, The Turning Point of Building. In 1961 to 1963, he was commissioned to design the skyscraper headquarters for the Italian steel industry in Genoa, and in connection with this, to redesign the harbor area. From 1964 to the present, he has been professor at the University of Southern California, director of the Building Research Division, and chairman of the Graduate School of the Department of Architecture. The gentleman that I present is one of those identities that is by way of being a kind of monument. He has been and is now a vital participant in two kinds of worlds. He is like a man standing on a bridge. One of the classic few that for good or bad probably never will happen again. For those of us who dare call ourselves his friend, it is difficult to realize the dimension and the consequence of his existence. He is a creature of science as it inadvertently approaches poetry. He is the accumulation of 1,000 irritations who unexpectedly transcends the limits of his own existence to suddenly and wonderfully address himself to the central problems and projects of the living conscience. I introduce him in this strange way because I would not attempt to measure him as a human personality. For this kind of true original, for this kind of unique creature, there is no prototype. There is some mysterious genetic composition that has ignited this man. There is a recipe for this kind of reasoning, human inhabitants, of this kind of reasoning human inhabitant, that society would be well advised to find again and nurture and carefully treasure. And so I bring to you this old friend, this aging Wunderkind, this concoction, this mixture of Loca and Apollonius of Tyana, this Konrad Wachsman. Now the projects that I will show, I will just go briefly so that we may see what he accomplished in his life's work. Many people know this star of Konrad's, which is relates directly to what Esther spoke of in speaking of this organizing teams of 12 to build housing in the French camp. This is a structural kind of organization which underlies all of Wachsman's work, and it is interesting to see the time in which he spent making efforts to relate various activities, whether teaching, structural organization. But order was one of the time efforts which he spent in his life. In the early years in Germany, 1927, he built this. No, it's not an auditorium. It's a sanitarium for children. But it is for that sake most remarkable. It is not done by the prefabrication system, but it shows that kind of order and articulation in all of the parts. He won a national prize as a result of this building, and it's rare in the world to find such carefully articulated work as this is at a very, very early stage in the development of modern architecture. The kind of care which he puts into every part, the proportion to every window, to the space between the dimensions of the buildings, is characteristic of the work which he did all of his life. This is the very earliest stages, of course. It's just a little pavilion associated with the tuberculosis sanitarium. And then this institute building, which again, in its early days, shows the kind of organization which is quite fine. And in these same years, this residence office building, actually, I'm sorry about that. And here, a house which is the pitch roof. If you look carefully, it is beautifully organized, and the proportions of the parts are very fine. I wouldn't mind living in it myself, even today. There's very good parts for those that care to look into without a little remodeling. Still further aspects of it. And then he built a house for Albert Einstein. I once said to Konrad, how could you make that with shutters and all those things in that house, and the wood paneling in the library? And he said, Einstein said, Konrad, are you going, I've all my life wanted the dark wood paneled library. Are you going to keep that from me? So he didn't. These two photographs are interesting. This is the house that it was originally, and this is a photograph that Konrad took 2 years ago when he went to Germany, and they had restored the house. And they worked very hard to do it precisely as it was, but Konrad and I looked at some of the photos that we were not quite as happy as we might have been, but the effort was there. They made it too dark, and they did other things that they had to best with its fixed to do it. Here's the fireplace in the living room, which it was. And the, again, from the living room, view looking out, the view looking in from out, two directions. Two more. Last view is Einstein's house. And the tennis pavilion, which is prefabricated and made of soft Unmark, and it spans 28 feet between the columns. It's quite a good distance for a prefabricated wooden structure. This was one of the great series of buildings he did at this time. And then he left, as Esther pointed out, Germany for very good reason. And finally, he went to Rome. And here are the buildings that he built in Rome. This is the only material I could get in time for this lecture, but it is a concrete apartment house and another building with the plan of a series of shops, stores, and then the bridge that he designed. It wasn't built, but this was the beginning of the practice there, which was again dissolved with the war. And then he, through this great experience that he had in those trying years and came to America, he developed this tubular frame. The one that Esther referred to as stemming from a map post, that was new to me. I didn't know that. But it was a tubular mobile arc, we called it. It was an airplane hangar which was prefabricated parts to be assembled in various shapes. These are just the elements with which it is constructed. And again, these, of course, are photographs of models because it was never built. But this is the main structure sitting on 4 columns, and it's enclosed. A series of doors which work on little motorized wheels. And the whole, there you see the doors on the left, here you see them partially enclosing the space. The idea was that you could go into or out of this with airplanes and move the doors away. And this was part of the work that he did, which enabled him later to get his great work with the United States Air Force for a much larger hangar. There you see the doors partly open, partly closed, and the general nature of the construction. Now, Konrad became interested. He was in America at this time, and he had gone to live with Gropius and developed a panel system there. Then he came to California to develop it. This was abstract drawing on the left showing the planar relationship of cubes and how 12 planes will come together. And this central block, which represents such an organization, Robertson Ward has the real photograph for the seminar. He couldn't steal it from him, he couldn't give it to me. But you will see it a little bit later. And from this principle, he developed his series of joints, panels for the General Panel Corporation House. And down here, the post, one plane against 2 planes, the T-shape, the cross, and all the conditions that come up in the plan of a prefabricated building. And inherent in this, of course, is the invention of the whole system of fastening and building and manufacturing the parts. Here you see a mock-up of the section through the panel system, and there a plan applied on a modular basis of these panels, and a little bit of an isometric in the house, and a model made of a pair of houses with the roofs, and showing them partly assembled, partly not assembled, so one can see the nature of the construction. The model went further, and they raised the money through grants from the government and private people and whatnot, the millions that were needed. They went over into the valley of Burbank, and they bought this building, and the interior of it looked like this. But Konrad then had to design a whole production system for his panels, because now it was the real thing. He couldn't keep it on paper any longer. And here it is equipped. Very carefully worked out production system, and this, I think, was one of the things Konrad is always very proud of. It's actually worked when it put into operation. Worked very well. You see here the finished elements prepared, ready for assembly. Then you see the panels being assembled, and in that same fashion we looked at. and other stages in the assembly, the panels, finishing the door frames and the window frames, plywood, testing, and so on. And now the panels on the left are on a railroad car ready to go, rail wagons ready to be shipped out to the site. In the center here, they have arrived at the site. The panels, the whole system was organized so that everything was put onto a truck in a certain way, it went out a certain distance from the factory, was delivered to the site, unloaded, and was in just the position that it should fit into the building, so they lifted each piece off, they were ready to install it in the house. And here you have the concrete foundation with the framing for the first floor of the panel starting up. Further completed now. Floor, that's conditions, the floor not on here. Yes. The other conditions showing the panels. It's interesting to see the very nice proportion of the panels and the openings, which finally resulted from this prefabricated system. Here are the ceiling panels on, then the roof panels you put on top of that, and the ceiling panels are finished, then these ribs are put on, and of course the sloping roof had to have a sloping roof in those days. You get as flat as you could. And finally, it's a finished house, which for a prefabricated house I would agree with John and Vance's statement that it is the finest that we ever saw. And the kitchen, the living room, the breakfast area. This is all built right here in California houses. And here, these photographs to show the elements actually assembled in the house. A door, a wall panel, a post, the window, and each proportion. It reminds me very much of a Japanese house approach. He had to move rather quickly to the Japanese. They had 1,000 years. They had one. The exterior view. Two more views. And of course, the General Plan Corporation, as every other prefabricated housing system at that time, ran into financial difficulties. There were problems that they had not counted upon. One, having a steady flow of orders to keep the factory smoothly working. And also, one little element that hadn't been thought of was that you had to buy the material and pay for it a year ahead, because the plywood companies make the plywood for you unless you pay them in advance. And that just 1 year's material is not very comfortable for the parent company. At the time when these houses were just finished, you received a grant from the government to make a punch card system. And this modular coordination system was to classify all building materials and so on. You know, the needles went in, and you called out what you wanted and pulled them out, and you got information that you were looking for. But this, of course, never went much further, because simultaneously, the Wicked University of Illinois built a 100-foot-long computer. And before they were finished, these cards were not needed, because you can now carry in your coat pocket something that would give you all of this information, memory, and so on. But at the time, it was the most advanced system of classifying, finding, discovering, and recalling information of this very elaborate nature in the building process. And as a result of the Mobile R hangar and this success with the General Panel Corporation's houses, they gained the confidence of the United States Air Force, and they asked them to build a hangar. half of the B-51s in the Air Force had been destroyed in a terrible storm in Arizona. And they wanted hangars that could be prefabricated and erected around the world to take care of those airplanes. So they asked Konrad to do it, and he proceeded. And these are some of the drawings which he made in the development of it. He showed there on the left the little connectors, and all these parts are either the column connectors, the ends of columns, the joint where you have to collect and hold together the various elements, in this case, for pipe construction. Here it shows assembly of the connector joint. And an assembly drawing, an assembly drawing here showing the, too late. Again, a great assembly in the center. This shows the roof plans and the roof system and columns. Then again, the complications which apparently occur in the support of the nature, but each one is a similar joint, a similar relationship of direction of forces and pipes, but it's all standardized. It's like a mechano set that you can put together as you will. Here, drawings showing the various stages in the assembly of the parts, starting with one part and the next, the next, the next. Because in a structure like this, which cantilevered from the column out 150 feet, is a very great cantilever. This was necessary so that the plane could go in from the outside with its wide wings. And this is carefully fitted to the shape of the plane, so there's no extra space enclosed other than what is needed to put the planes in and to service them for cap. This shows now the elevations, sections, the roof plan showing this structural and panel organization. It's very great, and I think very beautiful building. And then, one day, Konrad came rushing into the Institute of Design, telling he was going out first, came back so excited, because what had he done? This is where he'd been. That little element there was one of the connectors which had come out of the forge, the real part, forged with the machine, and he brought it back. And a little bit later, of course, he got a whole collection of them into his office. Well, these are the parts that were, that on the left, is that little part that you see that he was enjoying so much. The real thing, up to that time, it had been mock-ups in wood and analyzed by the structural engineer, but no real forged production element. Now we have the production element. And here you have those kinds of pieces which meant a great deal to Konrad because it was the secret of the whole structure that those would clamp around the pipes to drive in the wedge and you can build any kind of structure that you would like. Here, enlarged that joint, which looks so complicated, probably is, but it worked. It was never completed as a building because at this moment, when they were ready to go into production, I got a telegram from the Air Force to stop Konrad's project. So I said, what have you done? What's wrong? When I called and found out what was wrong, that some bright officer in the Navy, at Air Force, with the naval officer in the Air Force at that time, had the idea, we've got a good airborne system. If we have a bad storm, why don't we fly the airplanes where there is no storm? What could we be doing for? This is terrible that they thought of that when they did, because 2 weeks later they'd have had to hang. a series of views of the hangar, of the model. This is a very elaborately made plastic model. Students are very useful. They glue this together with pleasure. Thousands of little pieces each one is very carefully. They were die formed, so they were very, very precise and accurate. But it was a lot of time. So these together. I never thought of it as a smile. Looking down on the roof. And another view looking down another portion of the model. And that the general view of the whole building. The engagement of our slides isn't quite perfect. We need to get them into the projectors aligned a little bit better than we have. That was the last slide from the screen. Now, simultaneously, Konrad all right. Developed a system of team study, which I have always admired greatly. The idea behind it was that students who come without much information, if organized into a team with the general problem stated generally, but then as groups of 2 or 3 sub-members of this larger team would research, investigate various aspects of the problem, bring their information back to the classroom, and then after a week or a certain period of time, 2 weeks, exchange it with the next group and keep rotating and exchanging that information so that before they would be done with a series of weeks of study, they would have started, say, upper point there, right at the top, and come down, down, down. We've gone through all the areas of study that they were talking about. Week by week, they would exchange with another group. Then they could repeat that, or they could pool their information and produce the final building. Konrad was very careful in all parts. For instance, the table here represents the students. Streams of 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. And they each have a number, and they keep that number. They always sit here, and when they present their week's information, the next group that takes it is of that group. And when they present theirs, it is that group. And this group presents to this group. This was done so that this group would never be talking to this group, and these people left out, forcing them to talk across the table. Little things of this sort help greatly when you try to keep attention of the students and get them to exchange information. The process of doing this, I think, has often enabled them to build more than they would have been able to do as individual students. He made a series of seminars to design, seriously, a panel system of development, a new development, rather more sophisticated than his general panel corporation house. And just at the end, after the students had studied this and made models of all of the parts and connections and the plumbing and so on, then they drew up some perspectives and applied it to a house, but you would not have designed a house until they had the system. And again, in Chicago, a sanitarium in which the rather more sophisticated than his own that he had built earlier in Germany, because this one is tubular steel, and the students invented on their own a system for the roof structure. He actually did it while he was on a trip to Europe, of penetrating trusses in two directions, so that there's a longitudinal truss, the members of which become part of the structural members of the cross trusses. And this prefabricated thing, he set up an ideal situation in the desert, so they had to ship in all the parts, therefore they couldn't pour concrete on the site and so on. And they produced this building, which in detail saw all the parts, the walls, the roofs, the spaces, the panels, were beautifully designed and proportioned. Here's the truss system that he built. Again, aspects of the same problem, partly assembled, partly open. And then two end views, one without an end panel, one with an end panel, in which the structure is allowed to make its own statement. Then, of course, again, a series of the seminars in many countries, the sand, and here they made the metal structural system of organization. Here the models, there is the kind of colored diagram which they used in the various photographs of that. The sand. And in Salzburg, he gave a series of seminars in which he developed. Here, each summer, he gave a seminar. He developed a series of problems, and always in 6 weeks' time. The only way in 6 weeks they could get so far was to work very closely, this kind of a team study. And I'm sorry that I don't have clear, beautiful photographs of this. These are from a magazine published a few years ago. These were from a magazine, these colored photos. Bound and glowing. And then finally this system here, which was evolved later and into this luminous structure, which the system is set up with post-tension cables. And some effort made to have the light in it, but to have it also lit by a soft light throughout. He puts the great trusses to get rid of anything in the interior space. He was extremely sensitive and conscious of the spatial organization. As a Gothic cathedral is extremely complicated in its structure, apparently, to hold up a beautiful, central, simple space. Much of Konrad's works has a similar thing, which said if I would ever build a Gothic cathedral, they would say that insane vanity because nothing but structure. But he applied it for the similar reason that the cathedral builders did, accepted that kind of complication. Now, Konrad came one day to the Institute of Design. California. University of Southern California, School of Architecture. And we didn't have room in the inn for him. So he had to go across to the armory in the Rose Garden of the Museum of Science and Industry, which he loved because he had a great big room there that he could at least put up a model for display. And the students there made projects, which I have only a glimpse to show. But behind him, you see this blue and black thing as a 2-story high, full-size section through skyscraper apartment building. And with the structure shown, and the utilities and the pipes and so on. It was the kind of thing which I think was a good exercise for the students. And here are a few people that came that day. Robertson Ward came to see him. These ladies, I don't know. Charles Eames is here. I saw him a little while ago. I think Thornton April, someplace in there. He says he doesn't remember coming there. Well, there's Charles. There's some lady sitting here. I do know. There's a whole group of other people. But the students were excited about this problem and had dozens of drawings and models and so on. One little side issue that one student made with two others studied a kind of a greenhouse thing. And the system of ventilating, he thought of this ventilating system as a particle, so kind of said, yeah, it's a marvelous idea, why don't you develop it a little bit? So he did, and these things actually can go in any direction, any position, and so on. We went only to this stage, and of course, the student graduated, and doesn't exist beyond this. And after the project, typical. Konrad always got one good Japanese dinner. His goodness loved to give a dinner for him, and they went always to a Japanese restaurant each semester. They would take him and give him the dinner. And he always loved that. He liked it particularly because he felt, you know, that it was such a nice thing that they did. He enjoyed that dinner more than any other dinner of the year. Before he came to Los Angeles, just before, he'd been asked by the city of Genoa and the National Steel Institute to design a great skyscraper to expose the most modern techniques in steel construction that he could even dream of, and also to improve the harbor facilities, the arrival of tour ships, and such things. He did that. You can see there's two protruding Y shapes go back and into across a freeway. Here you see it a little bit closer up, the circle with the little black things. Then it's a whole traffic pattern which takes you into the center of Genoa and also takes you along the peripheral coast road, freeway, and just at the back is a skyscraper which the drawings when we showed them showed very great detail, very carefully organized. The whole thing made it on a prefabricated basis. If you want to have your secretary have a smaller office Monday morning, you just call the maintenance department and they will put an elevator with the panels and come up, flip them in, and she will be hemmed in small space. But if you want a bigger space, they'll have to wear it here. And it was very carefully organized, with storage space and so on. But at this moment, as something that seems to always happen in kind of communists threatened Italy, and people were selling their houses for $2 and leaving very rapidly. They didn't decide to build the skyscraper. And the city itself, the mayor was very excited about the plan and promoted it, but he was not reelected. So it was they wrote a great article a few weeks ago after Konrad's death saying what a great loss to our city that this project wasn't completed. And here you get the structural system and the ships coming in and unloading, the customs waiting for the pavilion, and shooting off by taxi cab and automobile and bus to various parts of the city. It was very carefully eaten out from an old part of the city, and what he destroyed was mostly from the 19th century area. With great care, preserved the spaces of the old city, of the old buildings. You can see here this cluster of old buildings in the front, and that was taken out so that and there's a bridge, beautiful bridge of brick going across, and this plaza, which was a kind of introduction of a modern building into the city with tremendous increase in floor area, which left the city unharmed, and at the same time added those facilities which they wanted. It created a good kind of planning, structural organization. Now, he organized things in 3 dimensions, and the problem was to see in this very elaborate configuration, how could you fix it in your mind? So he often made as the basis, say, 9 cubes. This is 1, 3, 4, 5, it's 9. You have 1 cube in the middle, and then you get every condition of cube that you could have, and a structural order which could expand, and that would be the minimum in which every condition you have. In the center, you have a cube which is surrounded by cubes. And then the diagonal structural treatment, the diagonal treatment of that, and then still more complicated in various points moving through the space. And that then evolving into a kind of structural system, it becomes very complicated. Using such a space grid to fix it in his mind. But going still further, he evolved a simple element, a suggestion of a structural element, which would be simply repeated. It would make the horizontal and vertical structure. Now it's getting pretty complicated. And this drawn into perspective looks like this. And about this time, I would ask you, would somebody like to show me how to build it? Because Konrad couldn't quite get it into his head, nor could anybody else. The complication is such that it's hard to think now. And he wanted to solve that problem. And he started to do it. He didn't get the whole way along, but he did it by trying to make a machine, a universal machine, which could assume any kind of position of part. Now, his original intention was to make 4 of these machines, and they would bring together and move, and they put together with the rapid efficient programming of the computers, could move and direct, put together and pull apart planes and lines to show this kind of complicated intersection which might occur, and to try to help to solve such complicated structural organizations which we find in nature that man is scarcely dared to, or is unable to reproduce at the moment. He could only get the money to make 1 machine, not 4, and he never had the funds to have it programmed because that was very expensive affair. It seems rather sad that he didn't. Here's the machine which moves into different positions. He has the film on it, but I don't have the film. Now, there's one other project which he made it through California. The gentleman bought a great deal of land in California City, he called it, because he found in this desert, 100 miles north of Los Angeles, more or less, a lake, an underground river from which they could make a lake. And he wanted to make this kind of development and have a city hall, and he asked Konrad to design the city hall, which Konrad did. The circular diagram on the left, it shows the California city at the center of it, and then the 50-mile radius of circles. It's a television system, and showing where it hits the mountains and gets stopped. But it turned out that this was in an area which would have its own television station because nobody wanted to have one in the desert. And then on the right it shows the building in the center of Bethel Park. The whole building itself compressed into the ground so that the wind will not blow, it will blow over it in this desert. The storms they have. There was an effort made to think of the effect of sand blowing in the wind. And this was the final result of setting up such a horizontal building, which you'll see in a moment, depressed into the ground somewhat, with a tension structure of cables pulled absolutely tight. His effort was to make them absolutely flat. Of course, the structural engineers wouldn't permit that. They had to have a little bit of paper, and they did finally, but he did get a clean design. And in the process, of course, they had to test the cables and all that kind of thing. Here in the laboratories in the engineering department of USC, and wind tests and stress tests, this model had to be tested for the forces to hold these cables straight and went down into the ground with anchors, weights straight into the ground, as well as using the building itself. This is a variant in steel. Finally, this support elements came into concrete. plan is the best I have. The lower level plan, which has the city offices in it, and the lower part of the courtroom, and on the left over there is the recessed hall, which goes down to the basketball above, which is the courtroom, and the town hall meeting room, and then the mayor's office, the upper level there. You went down into the basement to do your business, pay taxes, things of that sort. And this is the view of through the model, the elevation of the whole thing. And here, a model of the courtroom recessed on the far left, the mayor's office, and then the great space under that roof, but down in the basement is a great floor of activity going on. Here, a little lake or a little pond with the edge. The idea was this little glass box, which is the mayor's office. Of course, would have curtains to keep privacy, but because you couldn't walk in the water, that part would be kept totally open all the time. Each one to be tied. This is the area of the basement, and in the model, you have the seating for the town council, the ability to televise the meetings. The idea was to televise council meetings on the television station. The whole community would be able to see and hear everything going on at every meeting, and have entertainment too. Of course, the whole thing was made with the back projectors for screen showing and to relate it to the ability not only to meet and to talk and to discuss, but to have that information transmitted to everyone in our radius. Other views, looking straight in on the structure. As you went along the street, your eye was at the level of that structure, and the building was occupied, the space was below the surface of the ground. And a view of the mayor's office again, and its final development of this concrete structure which supported the cables. And here is final condition. It's like a bow with the string going across the top of the cables, and then the shell of the floor and the concrete. Konrad set up it one day. It is that building which is unique in having the least amount of steel per square foot of any building in the world, and the greatest amount of concrete. But it was actually sad that at this moment, again, one of those tragedies, the developer sold his building to another developer who signed a contract guaranteed to build this building, but then because it was expensive, which everybody always agreed that it was all right to be expensive, it's worth it. This man wanted more to make money, and he avoided building it all kinds of ways, rather than just to build it. And if you have the climate doesn't want for services, you're rather in shape. Thank you very much. Robertson uses different protection systems than I do. Konrad Wachsman's research work and later a consultant. He's an architect from Chicago who is one of the brilliant young men of our generation, and he's going to speak on an aspect of Konrad's work which I will let him explain to you. Robertson Ward.
That's a very hard act to follow, Conrad, and I've tried to put together some thoughts which, if you take them as shorthand and the graphics are really shorthand to just bring some of these things into focus. They're very simple sequences. I hope they're not too simplistic, but I wanted to take some
Louder.
I wanted to take some aspects of what Konrad has meant to me, and in two sequences, one of just taking what was very clear in Konrad's teaching initially with the Institute of Design in Chicago, where he brought out just the sequential three basic disciplines which he always worked with, one inside another, the essential joint, which meant a great many things to him, the modular order, and a whole industrialized incorporation of those into a whole industrialized building system. I also wanted to touch on some of Konrad's images of time, simplicity, and some of his images, as I saw them, of the future. This is what Konrad always took as the point in space. It represented the joint, but to Konrad it was much more. And this is where I'll start. This is where he'd have you start. One begins at this point. To understand the whole, one first has to know where one is, as a point in space, as a conjunction, as a line, as a connection. This is a point of transition and change. This is a point in time. This is a point of action. For Konrad, this was also a moment in time, an act. This might be an individual with freedom to move in all directions, or one of his favorite images of a point, a prisoner in a labyrinth. This is a joint. This is a meeting of stone on stone. The mason, the mortar, the infill. This is the in-between. This is a point of contact, relationships, the coming together. This is the essential point, the joint. Going up one step to what Konrad's modular order, which was the unit, the cell, the nucleus, which he so much felt that the growth of systems from one small element and the concentration of what one achieved by developing one, the qualities emerging out of one unit, the piece, the block, the brick, the tile, the early units, the modular order. I took the next sequence, not from Konrad's work, but because I feel there's such an affinity of this is the working drawing of an obvious modular order. These are the rules, many in one, replacement shop fabricated, the tea house of your choice, standard rooms, and small space with change. Let's go. In this case, the carpenter, the master builder, with control over both material production and building construction, and knowing in this tradition a somewhat prototype of industrialization, of knowing comprehensively manufacturing, designing, assembly, and going up with the same rules to the larger model with elegance. And this, the modular order. The step of industrialization coming in, as Konrad took, is the first, as he put it, the first bang of steam coming in the early 19th century. Much of this started in the colonial expansion, requiring housing and beginning in some of the British aspects and even the late 1700s on sending out panelized dwellings to the colonies, particularly Australia. This was some 1833 wood panelized houses, all parts standardized and dimensionally coordinated, all furniture and all accessories included. Several hundred prefabs being sent out in 1849 to the California Gold Rush from England to the West Indies. In 1851, Paxton's giant stepped forward with the Crystal Palace, a part of which, when demounted for the move, was actually shipped to Durban, South Africa, to be re-erected as a sugar store. In 1854, over 30,000 iron prefab packages were shipped to Australia. In 1855, Paxton organized 1,000 of his Crystal Palace workforce at Sindemont for panelized building erection in the Crimea, the Crimean War. And over 2,000 wooden barrack and hospital huts were shipped and erected with more colonial work. And the British experience in the Crimea led to extensive use of panel prefabricated hospitals during the American Civil War and after, as this one, as well as adoption by others, including the German army. One story relates to the Danish pacifists, horrified by the field casualties in the Schleswig-Holstein War with Germany, developed a similar panelized hospital system and eventually moved to Silesia, to later become the firm Christoph and Lindmark. Active overseas development of prefabricated buildings continued in England, Germany, France, and other colonial powers up to and beyond the 1920s. This was the scene upon which Konrad appeared, as Esther has related, an ex-cabinet maker and carpenter seeking enlightenment and persistently elusive stimulus in the astonishing chaos and ferment of Berlin of 1921. Frustrated at every turn, defeated by an apparent cruel fate, a greater fate guided Konrad inexorably to the spring of enlightenment he had vainly sought. Konrad states, quote, Hans Polsig had sent me to Christoph and Unmark, the largest wood construction factory in Europe, located in Niski, Silesia. Here I suddenly sensed the real equilibrium between man and nature, and like a miracle, for the first time I saw there in these large factory halls, production machines producing. And what was the product? Prefabricated panel systems for housing, hospitals, schools, which were already manufactured there before the turn of the century and shipped all over the world. In the split of a second, I understood that mass production was more than a technological event. In fact, I sensed that industrialization was incredibly important in every respect. I repented already that I had not become a tool maker. I was only a carpenter, therefore seemingly against mass production. I came to stay for a few weeks. I stayed more than 3 years. It was my revelation, and I was only 24 years old. What an incredible conjunction of fate for this wanderer. It was really a miraculous point in time, a direct meshing, joining with a productive momentum of the most developed industrial innovator in this vigorous new technology. An instant connection, a psychic linkage, and immediate comprehension at these levels. One, of the finite and fundamental classic geometries of materials and physical conjunction, at Konrad's level of the joint. Two, of the old logics of pre-industrialized modular disciplines. And three, of the new logics of new productive capacities evolved in 100 years of industrialized growth. I'm convinced that Konrad did have a literally blinding revelation at Niski because he was so uniquely and fortuitously prepared for it. It was the searching taproot, reaching the desert water, and the whole organism bursting into full flower. Let me back up and explain these three separate disciplines more clearly. I know Konrad recognized their distinct boundaries, taught them as these distinct disciplines, yet frequently referred to them under the collective goal of industrialized building. Let's look at Konrad at this point from the standpoint of just the joint. Konrad, as cabinet maker and carpenter, knew with instinctive mastery of the master craftsman all the classic disciplines of the joint. He had worked with materials, knew how materials normally meet, what kind of finite hierarchy of geometries one encounters, the limited nature of how things come together, and the structural transfer, the joint solutions which he later generalized very clearly and classified. He knew these inherently at that time and had instinctively mastered them as carpenter, cabinet maker. And later they were to be consciously and rigorously explored and mastered further. We have a feel of Konrad's image of this joint, the discipline of the fundamental origin of the modular order. Here again, who but Konrad, the cabinet maker and carpenter, experienced in mastering the precision of interchangeable parts, of drawer units, cabinet work, would be as uniquely prepared to understand the larger sequences of modular order. The lessons of the whole traditional Japanese experience were known, but were not widely evident, for no doubt. led from the Nazis to Japan in 32, and it wasn't until 33 that much publication of such places as the Katsura were made. But Konrad, with his innate craftsman's knowledge and eager searching mind, found himself at the wellspring of industrialized modularity at Christoph and Unmark. Konrad states, quote, "Something basic was already there, the general line to conceive, the thought of time, the instinct to react to values, the willingness to learn, to discover, to invent, the constant preparedness to be inspired and always looking into the future. I discovered pragmatically the whole world of difference between precise facts and make-believe. I began to understand that causes create effects and not vice versa." End quote. So here, with Konrad's unique understanding of these two first orders and their interaction consequences, the concept of achieving with industrialization in order with the productive resources of modern industry as Christoph and Unmark could but only overwhelm him in the logic of this revelation. Other things followed immediately. He sensed the master craftsman, he personally, Konrad, cabinet maker and carpenter, no longer would determine the quality and performance of the finished work. Now the machine was the new determinant, the performance characteristics of the precision machine, its design and tooling, its integration in the comprehensive production flow. The design of the units to be produced in turn determined the whole nature and number of this production flow. But the units had to optimize the potentials of the technology. Joint fabrication now had to respect the machine, not the craftsman. The modular order had to be carefully, precisely determined and designed to minimize numbers and maximize functionally significant combinations. The role of the classic architect, the selector of the master craftsman's skills in the field, no longer was relevant. He, Konrad, saw the key role as mediator, as designer, the integrator of these multifold decisions, which determined the match of functional social performance with productive technological resources. The production, the shipping, the transport, the erection, standards, the catalogs, communications of systems, choice and performance, continuing research and development in all aspects of the system, all these were part of the new role of Konrad in this Christoph and Unmark industrialized systems effort. Other logical images emerged. Building became, to Konrad, inaccurate description for many operations. Assembly was the act. Architecture became an imprecise word. He saw the machines as neutral, as tools in the process. The objective of design was the finished product, the components of the produced system, that the object to directly design was the tool itself. In Konrad's mind, the product, the physical product, was only a copy, the positive print of the master negative. The master negative was the tool. The master craftsman had now become the master toolmaker. Such was the revelation, the conversion of Konrad Wachsman and Sielski Silesia in 1923, a conviction that continued to mature in crystalline clarity throughout the next 57 years. That the creative act, the forethought, the pre-planning, the anticipation for the built environment was to be achieved by science and technology through industry. I throw out to you now a tenuous hypothesis, a possible example of the subsequent flowering and further mastery of the discipline of the joint, a stimulus to further clarity of Konrad's growing tools. I jump to Granada, Spain, some 10 years later. Konrad writes, I cannot describe the impact which the Alhambra, or the Generalife, and many other buildings from the Moresque civilization had made on me. Here is an image from Aronofsky's The Ascent of Man, which I have had a feeling that Konrad, with all his supreme sensory antenna so fully extended, and Konrad relates a Granada gypsy party in some of his accounts, which is just a marvelous feeling of how alive and aware Konrad was. And to me, imagining this Konrad contacting the flowering of the Arab geometry, imagining how these two came together, and the kind of joy that Konrad expressed when he met a stimulus of this sort. Bronowski goes on relationship to the whole geometry and symmetry and to aspects of some of the proofs of Pythagoras which had taken place in Granada. And there are things that relate so much to the sense of the emphasis on the point as representing space, the elucidation of the symmetry of plane space, and here are some of Konrad's later aspects of the whole feeling of rotation of geometry around a point. I can't help think that there was a germination taking place that possibly was the seed of Konrad's motion machine much later. Certainly this and countless joints like this. Konrad had some very specific images of time. Quote, the past is the past, the present is only in passing, but the future is everything. Konrad phrased this in a number of ways, but the moment of the present was the magic reality of life that he poured overflowingly into the cups of all of us around him. He knew that what really matters is action now for the future. In terms of the specific actions in the area of the built environment, there are obvious consequences. If the process of action can be represented by this diamond shape in the field of time, the traditional design process can be seen as sequential decisions in this manner, and that each process would have the various progressive steps of, within each sequence. As we all know, however, more and more significant decisions are now removed to other and earlier sequences upstream in this time flux. We select more, we design less. This is particularly true of more integrated component building systems. The upstream decisions are coded for components to be used in the present. Accordingly, design action now and present can only be for the future. For Konrad, action now for present or near future use was not addressing a significant problem. It was self-indulgent and without consequence. Accordingly, he considered that the word, this was one of his feelings, that the word architecture should be replaced with some other word symbol because it became so inappropriate to him in seeing this whole extended sequence which he felt necessary to tap the resources of industrialization. The discrepancy between the quoting Konrad, the discrepancy between the traditional role of design versus now rapidly emerging incomparable new situations practically forced the need for other catalysts to allow completely different values to grow. If the word energy is acceptable as being embodied in every human endeavor, then the future making of shelters will demonstrate in planning, function, and form that such new needs must be quite differently interpreted in their effect as compared to the making of custom-made buildings. Not only based on intelligence and skill, but with fantasy and a profound humanitarian spirit, will the new assemblage emerge into the language of design. The circle of problems demanding an uncompromising, time-determining answer has expanded enormously. They point to solutions along the lines laid down by science and technology, far more powerful in their effect than the deliberate pursuit of aesthetic fountains. The different fields of knowledge have become too complex and too tightly interrelated, and hence too sensitive to permit evasions or shortcuts. It would be too late to develop the production technology, the industry, at the moment a building project has to be executed. One cannot contemplate, do research, collect experiences, and apply all the results at the same time. This was a lasting conviction that Konrad carried with him for the rest of his life, and the feeling that one could only work for the future with a time span related to what he felt one had to enter within in the sequence of industrialized decisions. Konrad had a particular image of simplicity. It was an image of great order and clarity. It was a quest for simplicity in a very fundamental sense. Konrad states, the question, what is simple, becomes a starting point for all reasoning. The difference between the simple and the monotonous, the blank and the all-illuminating, is not based on considerations of taste and is unaffected by emotional values. The time-dependent concept of simplicity is defined by circumstance, by what is possible, and by what can be objectively compared. It is impossible to imagine a building being too simple. Over-simplicity in this sense is inconceivable. On the contrary, hardly anything is simple enough. However, when something is very simple, a product of necessity, when it is also perfect and therefore identical with the concept of beauty, then it is also perfect. The statement made by a building does not originate in the projected mimicry of a facade. Even the simplicity of an emergency shelter, reduced almost to naivete, may show greater forcefulness and would be a virtue compared with the deliberate artificial disguising of a function. A building should be satisfying for its own sake alone. If it is not, this simply means that in terms of function, it has failed to propose true purpose, for the form of the building directly reflects the demands made by space and substance. However, these demands have become both more exacting and more general, and in their generality are no longer fixed by the unique, particular, and the individual. I see Konrad's image of simplicity as striving for the simplest structural order to achieve the intended functional need. The structure in this case being the general physical solution. A number of years ago at the Upshur Womb, a study was made trying to identify and place man-made objects, physical and organic systems, in terms of two variables, the functional complexity and the vertical, and structural complexity and the horizontal. Different objects in organic systems were plotted on a chart like this, with the functional complexity, the vertical coordinate, structural complexity, again, the horizontal. Relatively less complex man-made objects like such as buildings were close to the origin of the lower left and lower center. Further up would be such things as computers, this being on a logarithmic scale, would be further out, both in structural complexity and functional complexity. Further out still would be, say, the human genetic cells, and even further out, the human brain. Vastly more complex in both structure and function. This lower left group of built objects of, say, buildings, those in the far left would represent structures of a simpler order, particularly those of simple elements used in different combinations, whereby through these permutations a high order of functional performance was achieved. In this select category, I would place two candidates. The whole traditional of the Japanese house and so much of Konrad's own work. Certainly, if there was any single quality of Konrad's work, it was the quest for clarity of the simplest order to achieve the required functional complexity. Systems of simple elements which can combine in significant functional permutations would lie in this high performance area. Bromley has emphasized Konrad's great contributions in team teaching. This Konrad achieved by inculcating in a group effort a respect for the conjunction of the simplest elements, a respect for the productive tools that can create each part, a respect and an awareness of the choice of order appropriate to particular problems. And understanding that only a